Thank you guys for an opportunity to speak to the crowd today. And I'm going to let Bernie just kind of navigate my dozen slides or so. And I can probably cut mine a little short and help us get back on track time-wise. Morgan Gray and Pat Havens with Corteva got a hold of me. They support a lot of our wetlands work amongst ag landscapes and asked if I'd be willing to visit with the crowd today. And more than happy to. And I just want to make sure you know I have my Corteva hat on. So I'm Ducks Unlimited and Corteva today, if you will. I don't know how many of you guys know about Ducks Unlimited, but I want to give a little bit of background on Ducks Unlimited, a 83-year-old private, not-for-profit conservation organization that focuses on wetlands, focuses on waterfowl, but as we're talking about today, wetlands do so much more. And our organization's finally becoming comfortable with the fact that while the United States and Canadian waterfowl hunters are who founded our organization, and they're very supportive of us, we need more support for conservation than that. And so we're doing a really good job, I think, of sort of being a ducks and more. It might take the rest of my career for us to crack that, but we're headed that direction. And some of the benefits of wetlands that are beyond waterfowl is what I want to talk to you guys about today. So next slide, Bernie. We'll let Bernie struggle with the trigger finger as Lori did earlier. So we focus our work in priority areas, just like Lori talked about priority areas in Ohio. We have North American priorities, and the red is the breeding grounds for so many waterfowl and other wetland dependent species, the prairies through the western boreal. And then we have the non-breeding or the migratory hotspots, which include the California Central Valley and Mississippi Alluvial Valley, Gulf Coast, and then all kinds of level 2 areas. And the reason we do these kind of priorities is to make sure we focus our resources, our time, our science, our monitoring, on the most important areas for wetlands and waterfowl across the continent. We spend, the way we like to say it, and y'all know the old 80-20 rules, we spend 80% of our time and resources in the priority areas, and certainly there's lots of other good work to be done outside those areas we spend the other 20% on. Bernie? So what I want to talk to you about today is our private wetlands conservation impacts on water quality and other wetland functions here in the Mid-South. And the reason I like to pick the Mid-South is because that's my position with Ducks Unlimited, is to direct our programs in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. Basically, I say from Cape Girardeau to New Orleans, 25 million acres of the lower Miss floodplain and its tributaries such as the Red River that you can kind of see outlined here, the Arkansas River, so on and so forth. And I want to sort of divide my notes up into two things today, and that is our work in working wetlands. In other words, our work in wetlands that are still used for agriculture and aquaculture today, and then talk about the restoration efforts for the land that's just simply not productive enough agriculture or aquaculture-wise to stay in production. It needs to come back out, needs to go back into native wetlands, and primarily that's forested wetlands and emergent wetlands in this part of the country. So our network of completed projects today in this region is about 2.5 million acres. And again, it's mostly divided between forested wetlands that have either been protected or restored through various programs, forested wetlands, emergent wetlands, or it's still agriculture. Next slide, Bernie. One of the most popular programs that Ducks Unlimited is very involved with, especially the restoration efforts, is the USDA Wetland Reserve Program. I think everybody's heard of WRP that's here. It's basically the WRP is its biggest here in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. Go ahead to the next slide, Bernie. We're approaching 750,000 acres in the valley that's been restored, basically a cropland that's, I always tell farmers, it's like, is it still flooded in June? And if the answer is yes, then we need to put it back to wetlands, because you just can't really farm ground that's wet that late in the spring, that wet in the year. Like I said, we're about at 750,000 acres in the region. And the goal is to get up to about, add about another 1 million to that. And we think we will have the frequently flooded farm ground that's flooded like 2 out of 5, 3 out of 5 years put back into forested wetlands. Next, Bernie. A couple of studies that I wanted to pull data from to share with you guys. I'm not going to show any models, but I am going to show some results. Next slide, Bernie. And we do look at these wetland reserve sites and either look at them before and after, or look at them side by side with land that's been restored and land that hasn't. And I think it's easy to see here on the sediment export, and that's what this is. This is the total suspended solid or sediment export from these restored versus unrestored fields. And I think you can see that it's obvious when you take something out of cultivation and trying to farm it in a frequently flooded, frequent runoff situation, put it back to trees, the difference that it makes. Next slide, Bernie. This is another study that I just had up there a second ago from Mississippi State. And on the right side is the sediment export, and on the left side is all the different common nutrients we test for. And again, this is, instead of an annual export, this is a storm by storm. But you can see again that the total suspended solids are much less in the areas that have been restored back to native vegetation. On the nutrient side, we have a real common occurrence. I'm sure there's some experts here that could explain it, but when you get the water real clear, I mean, like, you know, it might look to have a little bit of tinge of tannin to it from the vegetation, the leaves and everything, but when you clean it up real good, the reactable phosphorus tends to show up. And we think that's because phosphorus likes to be transported around on the sediment particles. When you remove those sediment particles, it still likes to move around. And we find the cleaner we get the water, the clearer we get the water, the dissolved phosphorus tends to show up in it. So there's always trade-offs, and I'm sure that's the case when it comes to crop protection chemicals as well. Next slide. The next thing I want to talk about, I'm going to sort of jump away from the restored wetlands now, the frequently flooded wetlands in the Mississippi Valley that we put back to trees and native vegetation, and talk about the ones we keep in production. And the valley is a very, very productive farm ground, very productive region, important ag region for the whole world. And it's composed of rice, soybeans, corn, cotton, and some other crops. But the whole rice, soybean, rice rotation is just awesome for many things that are awesome for wetlands. There essentially are working wetlands. We have about 2 million acres of rice in the valley, so that means about 10–12% of the land, cultivated lands in rice production. And of course, it's in rotation with other crops, so it moves around on the landscape. And we use this rice cultivation to do great things for wildlife and water quality. Next slide, Bernie. Here's a rice acres by county. Just wanted to show you, here's the state of Arkansas, the delta eastern side of Arkansas, and you can see the darker the green, the more acres of rice there are. Next slide. But right along with all this intensive agriculture is your impaired watersheds. And this probably is no surprise. It's not because the rice is there. It's because the intensive agriculture period is there. And these are some fine, easy to move soils. In fact, the soils showed up in the Delta. The Delta was created by Ohio and Minnesota and Iowa soils. So it's fragile soils that can move. Fortunately, not a lot of topography, but it makes them very available for conservation practices that make a difference. Bernie? Some research results from my very own PhD work, which feels like it was even longer ago than Lori and I working together in North Dakota. Next slide. And it shows in oh, here we go. This is just a picture of the study area that we worked in. You can see we've kind of covered the western side of Mississippi, or the Mississippi part of the Delta, and the eastern side of Arkansas, the Arkansas Delta. The slide on the right is sort of a winter pick, a winter satellite pick that shows you just how much water is on the landscape during the winter time, either purposefully or from backwater flooding. And you can actually tell on that upper right graph, you can see the red's rice, green soybeans, and blue is water, but you can just see the mosaic of the managed fields or flooded fields that exist. And on the bottom, you can see it as well. There is, on an average winter, y'all, there is a lot of water on the Mississippi Alluvial Valley landscape, a lot of water. Next slide. And what we encourage our landowners to do and work with them through various incentive programs is to leave the stubble, at least leave the majority of the stubble in the fields, and that goes for all crops, and to plug the drains to where they hold the water through the rainiest of the seasons till about February. And of course, that does good thing to provide habitat for waterfowl, but it also, as you can tell here, drastically reduces the sediment movement off the field during the wintertime. The difference between disking a field and letting it drain all the way to leaving the stubble and holding the water through wintertime is like a 35-fold difference in the amount of sediment that leaves. You got to admit that high number is still not that high. I mean, it's certainly not compared to silt loam soils and where there's topography, but you can also see that the stubble flooded one couldn't be much lower, it couldn't be any better. So big difference. Next slide. So we took this one step further, and we have an effort today where we are trying to use surface water for irrigation. Surface water from drainways, from retention, irrigation retention, what we call tailwater or irrigation retention ponds. Everything in the world to do to use some surface water for irrigation before you go to groundwater. That's not only good for groundwater pressures, which we have on our aquifers here, but when you pull that water that's leaving in the canal drainage ways and you use that for irrigation, use it slowly, use it judiciously, let as little water leave the field, let it slowly leave the field. You can see that we're actually using growing crops right here to reduce the sediment export off of fields and to actually clean the sediment out of the drainage water. So this slide right here shows what we call water on, which is the water that we relift for irrigation out of the canal. Real prevalent in Mississippi and Louisiana. We pull the water out of the bayou. That's the water on. We run it through the farm for irrigation. We drop it out the end of the farm, and you can see that's the water off. And that's about a 7-fold benefit to soil being removed from the water that's being used for irrigation. So farms can be working wetlands. Rice really helps, and we're trying to perfect that here in the Mississippi River Valley. Next. So last couple of slides. Instead of reading all these, I'll just let you guys read them. I bet this has been a very repetitive suggestions or take-home points from the group. And you know, I know I just showed a few slides, but you know, managing wetlands for water quality, and I'm sure for crop protection, managing crop protection chemicals they can really be a huge asset. And what's hard is to do it at enough time and enough scale for it to actually make a big difference in the watershed or make a big difference across the landscape. That's the hard part, is the scale. You got to start with producers first. You know, anytime a group of us gets in the room together and decides what the farmers are going to do, and the crowd isn't mostly farmers, that's you're starting off on the wrong foot. I mean, DU and the Fish and Wildlife Service and Corteva and Purdue can't all get together and decide what we're going to tell producers to do. You got to listen to them, work with them, and let them tell us what they want to try to do and help them be successful. And of course, partnerships or leveraging resources, both time, money, and intellect is really proven to be, as a good friend of mine said, is partnerships take time, but you'll accomplish more than you would ever accomplish by yourself. So jump in. And then the last comment I wanted to make is, I know this webinar series here, this virtual event is really about crop protection chemicals, endangered species, and how to manage wetlands in the middle. But I just can't help but to think that if a wetland is truly sort of performing the way it needs to perform, and I mean that on the biological, geological, and chemical aspects, that it is functioning, you know, just like an engine and running like a very productive wetland, I can't help but to think that that can mitigate not only nutrients or sediments, but also crop protection chemicals that might be somewhere you don't want them to be, might not have been broken down enough, or whatever other challenges might come before you. I mean, just all the microbes, all the invertebrates, all the chemical changes in the water, the temperature changes, the soil being mixed together. I just feel certain the same thing that does good for water quality and nutrients could do good for water quality and us managing our crop protection products. I think that's it, Bernie, and tried to make up a little bit of time for the crew. And if there's any questions, I'd be glad to take them. No, I went kind of fast.
Thanks, Scott. We do have time for a few questions, so please unmute and ask away.
I do appreciate the opportunity to visit with you guys today, and I want to again thank Morgan Gray and Patrick Havens with Corteva, and thank them for the invite, and thank them for support of this kind of work on the landscape.
Scott, I'll ask a similar question that I asked Lori. So how do you find your partners? So what's sort of that matchmaking process, and how do you prioritize those you engage then?
That's a great question. You know, on the producer end of things, we have learned to work with the producer groups that are sort of either the state or the national representative. Sort of start there, you meet their board, you meet their committees, you meet their leaders, and you trickle it down from there. We always say, you work with farmers where they are. If they're real advanced, that's great, but if they're not, that's great. I mean, there's even more opportunity. But sort of Ducks Unlimited being with like USA Rice or the National Corn Association, National Soybean Association. Usually when you get to those groups, you work at the state level, like the Iowa Soybean Association. But that's a great way with the producer end. And then on the other end, working with corporations and foundations and folks that you hope will support you through funding and through expertise. We have basically found, everybody's got a new sustainability or new zero carbon issue, or, not issue, but our commitment, and working with those sustainability, which is exactly what I've done here with Corteva. That's Morgan Gray's job. She's over the sustainability efforts for Corteva. You start with those people, teach them the programs you're doing, and ask them if there's a fit. How can we help you, Corteva, with y'all's sustainability goals?
All right. Thank you much, Scott. Greatly enjoyed that, and looks like a lot of impact that you're having in your region there. So great to see.